everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Fiona at Drawings in a Drawer. Today I am again looking into an old sketchbook and trying to repaint something that I did, I think it was a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. I'm painting on Arches hot pressed paper. I do really love hot pressed paper, though it is much less forgiving than cold pressed. And I have to say, especially Arches hot pressed paper really gave me a hard time when I was starting out in my watercolour journey. And even quite later on, I literally put it aside for months and months, possibly even a year. And I just thought that painting on hot pressed paper was just a no-go for me. But later on, as I started painting on other brands and then I came back to the Arches hot pressed paper, I found that I was able to actually enjoy it. It is not easy to lift paint off of this paper, so again, it's really unforgiving, but I think it's the only paper that really does give you an extremely smooth and polished finish, and that is why I actually really love it right now, but I don't paint with it that often. I will probably end up talking about Arches hot pressed paper sometime in the future in some other video, maybe more in depth, because I think it's really a unique kind of paper and I can't find anything like it. But right now I want to talk about painting shadows in watercolour, which is mainly what this video is about. So painting shadows in watercolour can be quite scary, and there are two ways to do this. One way is slightly less scary and the other one is definitely more scary. So the way I'm painting shadows in this specific painting is by layering. So I usually tend to go in with a mix of something like ultramarine and maybe sepia, or add some like reds in there. And with this mix, I will start very watery and start covering the areas where I see shadows in the reference image and just assess how dark that shadow is once it's dry, because watercolor dries so much lighter. We never know what it's going to look like until it's bone dry. With the layering technique, you just assess, as I said, how light the shadow has dried, and almost always you have to go in with more layers. So you build up the darkness and the depth of the shadow gradually, usually through 5, 6, sometimes even more layers, but you have the time to assess how dark you're going slowly, and it's harder and more difficult to make mistakes. The other technique to paint watercolour shadows is to go in darker right out of the gate. I like using caput mortuum for this technique, and I use it especially when I have like one single sharp shadow across the face, which is not really the case with this painting because most of the face is in shadow. So usually when there's like a strand of hair falling across the face or a leaf casting a shadow where we have a very outlined shadow, then I will go in, as I said, usually with caput mortuum, with something that I like using, a colour I like using to paint shadows, and I will go in and probably just have to add another layer on top of that, so a couple of layers. That is, as I said, scarier because it's easier to make a mistake that way, and there's really no way to fix it. As you can see, I was swatching my shadow colours on the paper to make sure that I was using the right level of intensity and darkness, but that is still not enough, because when you're using the layering technique, the shadow you're going to see in your swatch, the colour you're going to see in your swatch is not going to be as dark as the one you're going to lay over the previous layers in your painting. So you've always got to be really careful and proceed with caution. If you're new to watercolour, sometimes it's also easier to start with something like ultramarine blue. I remember when I started painting, I used ultramarine blue for shadows, and that was my go-to colour with shadows. I also used cold pressed paper, which, as I said, is more forgiving in so many ways. And that worked fine for me until I became a little bit more adventurous and started reaching for other colours to paint shadows or mixing more colours together to create a shadow tone. So if you're worried, ultramarine blue is a good choice. Something else, when you're painting shadows and you've decided your shadow is not dark enough, don't try and go in and make the shadow darker while the paint is still wet. That is a recipe for disaster. You always have to make the paint dry, have to let the paint dry, and only then you can go in with the next layer. Otherwise, you will be creating splotches and hard edges and cauliflowers in your shadows, which really is something that distracts the eye from what it's intended to be picking up on, namely that it's looking at a shadow. Something else to keep in mind is that there are so many colours inside the shadows, and that makes it so much more exciting and interesting. So observe shadows in everyday life. Observe shadows when you go outside. Look at shadows on people's faces and see where they're deeper, where they're softer, and also on objects and in nature. And the reason why there are many colours inside a shadow is because shadows reflect the colours that are around them. So if there's greenery around them, if there's a sky above them, then we'll see that colour reflected, for example, in the face, on the forehead, etc. Something else is that there's different intensities inside the same shadows. So in certain areas, they can be darker and deeper, or they can get softer and lighter in other areas. So going back to dark and deep shadows, it sometimes can be tempting when we see such dark shadows to reach for black and just use that to get that darkness in right off the bat. I would advise you not to do that because black can be really opaque and it just takes away so much from watercolour's transparency, and I really try to avoid using black as much as I can, and I literally only use it to paint the pupils in the eye, sometimes the eyelashes or backgrounds, and that is all. I really don't use black otherwise, and definitely it's not a good idea to use it when it comes to painting shadows. Instead of reaching for black, I usually go for something like neutral tint or mix ultramarine blue with burnt umber, and you will get a colour that is really deep and really dark but still maintains some level of transparency. I hope you found my tips for painting shadows in watercolour useful, and there will definitely be more tips to come in future videos, so stay tuned. I am now uploading every single Friday. This is my fourth Friday in a row, so I'm really happy about that I was able to hold myself accountable and keep my promise. So if you're interested, please subscribe, leave a like, and would you please post the emoji of a paintbrush in the comments down below. That would really help me a lot to get the algorithm to push me out there. As usual, you can find the full tutorial for this linked somewhere in the bio or in the cover image of my YouTube channel. And yeah, if you want to support me on there, that's fine, and that would be great. Otherwise, a like and a comment is really all I need. So I am glad if you stayed all the way through this video, and I hope to see you next week, and I hope that you will watch my previous videos as well. Bye for now, and have a great rest of your day.